And I am live. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good whatever time of night or day it happens to be wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News Saturday for your Saturday of the 5th of January 2019. I am your hostess, Liviana, and I will be reviewing some recent news and giving you some commentary on it. So with that out of the way, I'm going to dive right in and start with my first article. This comes from the Fiscal Times. It was published on the, this is not recent news at all. I don't know why someone called it to my attention, but anyway, it was published in March of last year. So, but it is related to recent news. As some of you may know, Elizabeth Warren has tossed her, I don't know if she's tossed her hat into the ring yet. I think she's only launched an exploratory committee to see if she wants to run for president in 2020. But at any rate, she's certainly considering it. This is not really a surprise, and based on her behavior in 2016. But this article says, Elizabeth Warren has a new plan to improve health care, and it isn't Medicare for all. So, this is going to be pretty interesting for people who are progressive. Medicare for all, or more precisely, National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All, is being held up as a sort of litmus test for progressive candidates, or so-called progressive candidates, that if you don't support National Improved and Expanded Medicare for All, you're not going to get our votes, and with good reason. But anyway, so apparently back in March, a recent poll found that likely voters want the Democratic Party to prioritize health care if it controls the Congress and the White House in 2021. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat from Massachusetts, is on it. Warren on Wednesday introduced a new health care bill, and unlike the Bernie Sanders bill that Warren still co-sponsors, it does not call for a single-payer system. Instead, the legislation, called the Consumer Health Insurance Protection Act, aims to make insurance within the existing Obamacare system more affordable and protect more enrollees from insurance company policy changes and premium hikes. It would increase federal subsidies for people buying Affordable Care Act plans, allow more people to qualify for ACA tax credits, and impose tighter controls on private insurers. Health policy expert Charles Gaba calls Warren's bill and similar House legislation that was introduced recently ACA 2.0. Here's some of what Warren's plan would do. Limit insurance premiums to no more than 8.5% of income. Cap out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for those on private plans at $250 a month or $500 per family. It is $250 a month. Require insurers who sell Medicare Advantage or Medicaid managed care plans to offer coverage on ACA exchanges that have limited competition. Require private insurance plans to spend 85% of the premiums they receive on paying out claims, up from 80% under the ACA currently. Set limits on insurance company profits to match what those private insurers can earn from Medicare and Medicaid. Provide more money for ACA outreach and enrollment efforts. So this article goes on for a bit longer. Let me see here. I'm a bit nonplussed now that I've found that this is from March of last year. But anyway, I did basically, Liz states we need Medicare for all, and then and I'm translating for those who might not get her meaning. She says, but let's not do that now, and instead let's waste more time shooting people full of the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, as Dr. King called it. Yeah, this is not unexpected. I have described Elizabeth Warren many times as a faux-aggressive, and I've more recently come to use the term faux-aggressive opportunist to refer to her. So, the link for the article will be in the video description. So, check back in a bit. I will try to have all of the links to the articles I'm going over in the video description before the stream is over. So the next article is, in fact, more recent, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you view the news, it reveals. This comes from Truth Out. It was published on the 1st of January. And it's by John Quealy from Common Dreams. Excuse me for coughing. I do have a bit of I'm not really sure what, so I have some congestion and a little bit of sore throat. The Pentagon rings in New Year with joke about dropping massive bombs on people. While people across the world celebrated the dawning of the new year overnight, the U.S. military thought it would be funny to celebrate and make light of one of the things they do best, dropping massive bombs on people and places. In a since-deleted tweet, U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, which controls the nation's strategic missile systems and coordinates offensive nuclear capabilities worldwide, joked that while people in New York City enjoyed the dropping of the big ball during countdown to midnight, quote, "We are ready to drop something much, much bigger," end quote. Beneath the message was a video, as the New York Times describes it, of, quote, a B-2 stealth bomber soaring across the sky before releasing 2 GPS-guided bombs that exploded into a giant ball of fire after hitting the ground below, end quote. While STRATCOM deleted the tweet after about 3 hours, issuing an apology that the message, quote, was in poor taste and does not reflect our values, end quote, plenty of people had already taken screenshots of the message. Among the reactions of outrage on social media, Walter Schaub, former head of the Office of Government Ethics, simply asked, quote, what kind of maniacs are running this country, end quote. He was far from alone. Derek Johnson, executive director of the anti-nuclear weapons group Global Zero, said, quote, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you at U.S. STRATCOM the stoic guardians of several thousand nuclear missiles who definitely don't think raining death and destruction from above is some kind of joke, end quote. So if you would like to see the deleted tweet and even the video itself, they are available through this article here. And again, I will include a link to the article in the video description. Yeah, so that's a bit disturbing. I don't really think that, I mean, it was certainly in poor taste, and coming right after Happy Christmas, war is over if you want it, and all that stuff. Yeah, probably not the best idea. I'm going to be talking about that as well, Poppet. I believe I have an article set aside to talk about that. But the next article I have is actually just about Ocasio, to some extent anyway. This article comes from the from New York Magazine, The Intelligencer, and it was published on the 3rd, I believe, by Eric Levitz. Democrats are fighting about whether deficits matter. That's good. Last year, House Republicans voted to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit for the sake of delivering enormous tax breaks to the wealthy and corporations. Now, as one of their first acts upon taking power, House Democrats are preparing to prohibit themselves from adding a penny to the deficit for any purpose, including investments in things like climate preparedness, which could plausibly pay for themselves in the long run. This plan has outraged the party's far left flank, seeding a small-scale rebellion against Nancy Pelosi's leadership before she's even taken the Speaker's gavel. And all of this constitutes a welcome sign of progress. But before we examine why this particular episode of Dems in Disarray is a happy one, let's take a more detailed look at the plot. The Washington Post's Mike DeBonis and Jeff Stein offer a succinct synopsis. Quote, House Democratic leaders faced the prospect of a liberal rebellion on their first day in charge. Again, guys, come on. Stop referring to progressives as liberals. There are differences. The terms are not synonymous. They're not interchangeable. Progressives and liberals have been at odds over many things since, well, going back to at least 1916, but to be more precise, we're talking about social liberals who didn't really exist as a separate thought current in the United States until the end of World War II, and modern progressives who likewise grew out of the original historical progressive movement about 1946, and have battled about a number of things through the several decades since then. Anyway, their first day in charge, after prominent Democrats said they would oppose a package of rules changes endorsed by Nancy Pelosi, the incoming Speaker, Representative Ro Khanna of California and Representative-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York said they would vote against the rules change on Thursday. In the second vote, Democrats will take in the majority after electing Pelosi, Democrat from California, because of the inclusion of a fiscal measure known as pay-as-you-go or PayGo. That rule, echoing a provision in federal law and in the Senate's rules, would require the House to offset any spending so as not to increase the budget deficit. Liberals such as Khanna and Ocasio-Cortez and activists on the political left argue that PayGo amounts to a legislative straitjacket that could impede their efforts to pass ambitious social programs, end quote. The PayGo rule is substantively indefensible. It rests on the economically illiterate premise that balanced budgets are forever and always desirable. In truth, deficit spending is the only responsible means of combating severe recessions, and as a perfectly sound means of financing worthwhile public investments in a context of low inflation and chronically low labor force participation, which is to say, in our current context. As a political matter, it is true that voters generally evince a fondness for the phrases, quote, fiscal responsibility, end quote, and, quote, balanced budgets, end quote. But it defies credulity to suggest that there is a significant contingent of single-issue deficit reduction swing voters who plan to carefully study the Democratic Party's changes to House procedure before going to the ballot box in 2020. Therefore, even swing district Democrats have no excuse for backing PayGo, and their attachment to the rule is maddening. All that said, it doesn't really matter in a concrete sense whether the House adopts a PayGo rule or not. Even if the House establishes a rule that all new spending must be paid for, it can waive that rule for any individual piece of legislation with a simple majority. Many Democratic opponents of PayGo have signaled that they intend to vote for the package of rule changes regardless, citing assurances that the rule will be waived if doing so is necessary for, quote, advancing key progressive priorities, end quote. More crucially, PayGo isn't merely a House rule, but also a federal law, and waiving that law would require a 60-vote majority in the Senate, or else the abolition of the filibuster, even if Pelosi's caucus rejected PayGo. Thus, the rule doesn't actually matter, only the principle does. If we knew that congressional Democrats universally supported using deficit financing to advance progressive goals, then the PayGo rule would be entirely inoffensive. If House Democrats want to have a fake rule that they can point to when Republicans propose tax cuts and instantly waive when progressives propose expansions of the welfare state, that's fine. The problem is that the rule reflects a genuine ideological commitment to fiscal responsibility, which will make it difficult to pass deficit expanding legislation through the Senate. Fortunately, the mere existence of a divisive intra-party fight over PayGo is a sign of vital progress. For decades, a belief in the necessity of long-term deficit reduction was a source of consensus within the Democratic Party. Democrats might fight about whether spending cuts were necessary, but the idea that new spending would have to be paid for with tax hacks was not controversial. Now it is, and that fact is more important that the details of the House's ultimate rules package. I think that means should be more important than the details of the House's ultimate rules package. Cana and Ocasio-Cortez lost a battle that didn't matter, and in so doing made some tangible progress toward victory in a wider war that does. So, now, I'm going to be talking about this a little more before the show is over. But let's see. That's the end of that article. So let me see what I have next on the agenda here. Because I might just skip ahead and continue to talk about this PayGo business. It is a subject which was brought up in the news quite a bit this week. It was talked about on Twitter. I posted some stuff about it on Twitter, mostly responses to other people. But at any rate, and I did talk about PayGo a bit last night, and I believe last week as well. Well, alright, I'm going to go ahead and take this one before I dive into more about PayGo. Yeah, because I do have more to say about PayGo, but let me break it up just a bit. And before I do that, let me have a look out here into the text chat, and see if anyone has any questions or comments. It's not just Trump, though, Poppet. This kind of neoliberal perspective has been pushed by every administration since Reagan got into the White House. It's neoliberalism. One of their typical strategies is to underfund or defund various programs, and then when those programs begin to perform poorly or fail, they can point at them and say, see, now let's just privatize it. So, I mean, this goes on in, you've seen this with the Tories in the UK, for example, trying to privatize the NHS. So, I mean, there is that. But, speaking of social spending, we do have another article here that comes from the Huffington Post. This was published on... I don't see a date for this. Oh, there it is, the 2nd. This was published on the 2nd of January, 2019, and it's by Jenna Amatuli. It says, Fox and Friends guest says people on food stamps watch porn instead of working. The head of a conservative think tank had a lot to say about people on food stamps Wednesday during an appearance on Fox and Friends. Star Parker, founder and president of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education, told the hosts that people on food stamps, otherwise known as the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, are sitting around and watching porn instead of working. That's due in part to the benefits being distributed by an EBT swipe card similar to a debit card, removing the shame of receiving government assistance, she said. And there was a tweet from Bobby Lewis that says, quote, Fox guest star Parker also asserted that actually it is good when people feel ashamed to be on welfare because food stamps once, quote, had this stigma about them, so people wouldn't want to be on them, end quote, end quote. And that was tweeted on the 2nd also. The old food stamps vouchers, quote, had this stigma about them so people wouldn't want to be on them even if they qualify, end quote, Parker said. And she goes on, quote, but now it's like an EBT swipe card, it's a debit card, so they take the shame out of it. The next thing you know, you have an economic crash. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, as food stamps are formally known, is one of the biggest U.S. safety net programs with 42 million beneficiaries in 20 million households. The average benefit per recipient in 2017 was about $125. The money is deposited each month on special EBT cards that can be used in grocery stores for almost any food item. And let's see here. And this goes on a bit longer, and I'm not going to read more of it, but I am going to make a statement. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I doubt Star Parker has ever tried to live on $125 worth of food a month. She's not a large woman, but she is slightly heavier than ideal weight. But I doubt that she has, because if she had tried to live on $125 of food a month, or the equivalent in the past of that amount now, she wouldn't be running her mouth about this. Right-wingers need to get it through their heads that people on public assistance are by no means getting a free ride. Often enough, public assistance takes the form of an insult to intelligence and dignity, and you're lucky if you can even subsist. If every Congress critter had to try to live for just, well, let's say 6 months on the resources available to the average person on SSI, without their credit cards or bank accounts or their credit rating, and without their reliable transportation, because you're limited as to how new and valuable a car you can own. So, you know, I mean, at one point, I don't know what it is now, but it used to be like $1,000. Your car couldn't be worth more than $1,000. Now, what kind of clunker is worth $1,000 that you can't actually rely on starting and getting you to the doctor's office, or to go down to your local welfare office for your qualification hearing that you have to go through every year or so? You got to fill out these forms every year and basically sell them your firstborn child. You have to tell them every time you take a shit. They want to know every damn thing about you, and then in return you get $125 to buy food with, if you're lucky, because I mean, that's by state. It varies by state, the amount that you get. I was on food stamps once, and this was not too long ago. I got $40 a month. $40 a month to buy food with. And the amount of money I was getting at the time on public assistance was, I think it was less than $500 a month. Not even enough to pay rent. Fortunately, I owned my own home, and so didn't have to bother with that. But I would love to see these Congress critters try to live on this kind of so-called free ride for just 6 months. I guarantee you that in less than 3 months, all of these programs would get a cost of living increase, because there would be no way they could do it. So, I mean, it's just absolutely ludicrous that, yeah, this is just very, completely out of touch with what is, with what the situation actually is. So, let's see. So then the next article is going back to talk about PayGo again. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and put this link into my notes so that I can add it to the video description here in a few. And so the next article comes from Common Dreams. And it was published on the 18th of December, 2018. It's by Josh Bivens, or Bivens. The bad economics of PayGo swamp any strategic gain from adopting it. The obscure congressional budget rule known as PayGo, or Pay As You Go, has burst into the news lately. A PayGo rule means that any tax cut or spending increase passed into law needs to be offset in the same spending cycle with tax increases of spending or spending cuts elsewhere in the budget. Incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has indicated that the House of Representatives will abide by PayGo in the next Congress, and this decision has sparked much controversy. Many Washington insiders assert forcefully that committing to PayGo rules in the House for the next Congress is good politics. The argument that it assuages fears of politicians who believe they must make public commitments to lower deficits to avoid being punished by voters who care deeply about this issue. If voters do indeed have strong preference for reducing deficits, then policymakers, even those who want to use fiscal policy to reduce inequality by expanding public spending and investment, must first commit to PayGo to convince these voters that budget measures can both reduce inequality and be fiscally, quote, responsible, end quote. The strength of evidence supporting this political claim is debatable. What's less debatable is that PayGo really has hindered progressive policymaking in the not-so-recent past. For example, it was commitments to adhere to PayGo that led to the Affordable Care Act, ACA, having underpowered subsidies for purchasing insurance and, even more importantly, having a long lag in implementation. The law passed in January 2010, yet the exchanges with subsidies only were up and running by 2014. This implementation lag meant that ACA's benefits were not as sunk into Americans' economic lives by the time a hostile Republican Congress and administration began launching attacks on it following the 2016 elections. It is a real testament to how much better the ACA made life for Americans that it has been stubbornly resistant to these attacks. But it would have been helpful to have a couple more years to have it running smoothly. But that didn't happen largely because the ACA's architects wanted to meet PayGo rules over the 10-year budget window. Our failure as a society to understand the economics of deficits and debt greatly contributed to the destructive impact of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. Even more fundamentally, it is terrible economics to view federal budget deficits as always and everywhere bad. Making good policy in the future will require that voters be educated on this front. Why not start now? After all, our failure as a society to understand the economics of deficits and debt greatly contributed to the destructive impact of the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009. The stakes of allowing history to repeat itself are high enough that we should take the time to quickly recap the history of how costly irrational deficit phobia has been. In the generation before the Great Recession, DC-based policymakers and analysts from both political parties cultivated an unhealthy degree of fear around federal budget deficits. This excess fear of deficits led them to miss the real dangers facing the economy as the Great Recession approached. The root of the economic crisis of 2008 to 2009 was the deregulation that allowed an enormous housing bubble to inflate to levels guaranteed to cause a deep recession when it inevitably burst. Yet most Democratic criticisms of the economic stewardship of President George W. Bush stemmed instead around his presiding over run-ups in federal budget deficits. In 2006, for example, then-Senator Barack Obama voted against raising the nation's statutory debt ceiling to signal his disapproval of excessively high deficits and debt. It was bad enough that expressed concern over deficits blinded policymakers to gathering economic storms elsewhere. It was even worse that this deficit fear-mongering was happening while the federal budget deficit was extremely small and shrinking rapidly. The budget deficit in 2006 and 2007 averaged less than 1.5% of gross domestic product, an amount that is absolutely sustainable forever. This excess fear around budget deficits became an economic catastrophe during the recovery from the Great Recession. Let's see. Despite multiple warnings that the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, of 2009 would not be at sufficient scale to generate a full recovery, 2010 saw a pivot away from defending the need for expansionary fiscal policy, that is, running deficits to finance measures to support the economy, and toward prioritizing measures to reduce deficits. A prime example was in the January 2010 State of the Union address, when the unemployment rate was at 9.8%, when President Obama said, quote, "But families across the country are tightening their belts and making tough decisions. The federal government should do the same. So tonight I'm proposing specific steps to pay for the $1 trillion that it took to rescue the economy last year. Like any cash-strapped family, we will work within a budget to invest in what we need and sacrifice what we don't," end quote. Why am I taking you on this extended walk down the memory lane of irrational deficit phobia? Because it had terrible consequences. The recovery from the Great Recession was the slowest in post-World War II history, and the degree of fiscal austerity can entirely explain its slowness. The figure below, you can look at this later, shows the growth in public spending per capita in the recovery following the Great Recession compared to previous recoveries. If this public spending following the Great Recession had followed the average path of the recoveries of the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, a full recovery with unemployment around 4% would have been achieved by 2013. Now, this austerity following the Great Recession was largely driven by Republicans both in Congress and in state houses, but the generation of bipartisan fear-mongering about deficits surely helped Republicans hold the line on spending cuts and claim that this austerity was fiscally responsible, even as voters suffered the economic consequences. The fact that Republicans' embrace of deficit reduction is complete hypocrisy and always takes a back seat to their desire to cut taxes for the rich is infuriating, but it doesn't change the fact that fueling excess fear about deficits, even when done in the service of good policy goals like fighting regressive tax cuts, has been terrible economics. This austerity following the Great Recession was largely driven by Republicans both in Congress and in state houses. Why is it repeating itself? That's really... Yeah, that's... Because that... Okay, better editors, people, please. Some people claim that the economic evils of PayGo are overstated. After all, any sensible Congress would waive it if the economy entered a steep recession and needed expansionary fiscal policy, right? Here it helps to look at the previous figure again. Most of that spending austerity shown in the figure happened after the official recession ended, but occurred while unemployment remained extraordinarily high. The necessity for expansionary fiscal policy is not confined only to official recessions. As the economy takes longer and longer to mount full recoveries after recessions, the need for fiscal policy to remain expansionary even after official recessions end is becoming clearer. Further, it is debatable whether or not some forms of spending, particularly public investment, should be subject to PayGo at all. Golden Rule Public Budgeting argues that investments can be funded through debt. This makes eminent economic sense. The textbook reason to think that federal budget deficits can cause harm when the economy is at full employment and starved of savings is that deficits can raise interest rates and hence cause a reduction in productive business investment. But if deficits finance productive public investment, then total economy-wide investment is unchanged, as public investment just substitutes for private investment and no economic harm is done. Oh wait, what? Blah 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 blah. Yeah. Does arguing against PayGo rules mean budget deficits are never harmful, or that we can spend all we want without ever having to raise revenue to finance it? No. Yes, but it does, because federal taxes do not fund federal spending. I'm sorry, they don't. But anyway, deficits can, in certain circumstances, potentially put a steady drag on long-run growth, and progressives need to be full-throated about the need for taxes to be higher to both prioritize economic bads, like greenhouse gas emissions and financial speculation, and to compress the income distribution to make for more broadly shared growth, and yes, over the long run, the large... blah, blah, blah. This is fucking economically illiterate to some extent. Federal taxes do not fund spending on the federal level. What happens is when federal taxes are collected, it is taking money out of circulation. It does not go into any kind of fund. The federal government does not need to tax or borrow in order to fund federal spending. Why? Because the federal government is the sovereign issuer of a free-floating... It's the issuer of a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency. It's not backed by any physical commodity. It's not restricted or chained to, for example, the value of gold or the amount of gold we happen to have in Fort Knox. And the debt of which everyone is so concerned is pro forma. That means it can't be called or force redeemed. And when it is redeemed, it's only redeemed in more of our fiat currency. The federal government cannot become insolvent in its own currency. So there's no. This is how federal government finances spending or funds spending by Congress authorizing the spending and the Federal Reserve basically writing a check or moving some numbers around between one account and another. The purposes of taxation at the federal level are to encourage the people to impute value to the currency and to remove excess currency from circulation and to remove excess currency from individuals who are accumulating too much in order to prevent them from having too much political power. Now, at the moment, we have this Supreme Court ruling in the case of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, which has taken the old notion of corporate personhood and granted to corporations the right to freedom of speech and defined money as speech somehow, so that we have all these corporate PACs and lobbying groups, and a massive amount of money is being funneled into the political process from corporations, and this is not good, not good, not good. So yes, we need to deal with that, but it can also be dealt with by passing an amendment to the Constitution which will undo the decision of the Supreme Court, and that is the only way you can undo as a ruling by the Supreme Court is to amend the Constitution, or to get somebody else in the court who will overturn the ruling in a subsequent case. And overturning rulings is not a very common thing, and even when it does happen, it seems to take several decades. Well, we don't have a lot of I don't think we should have to wait several decades to at least slow down the neoliberal hellhole to which we're headed, or the path, our race to it. Anyway, the current debate over PayGo and the new Democratic majority in the House of Representatives will have very little direct effect on policy making. The Senate is still controlled by Republicans, so little major legislation will be able to pass a divided legislature, and whatever the House decides to do with its internal rules, there remains a statutory PayGo requirement that can only be loosened by the House and Senate together. So in the end, embracing PayGo or not in the next House of Representatives is a purely political decision. In the short run, nodding toward conventional notions of fiscal responsibility and adopting PayGo will likely win approving nods from Beltway pundits, but there's a long game that matters here too. Eventually we need to get much smarter about the economics of debt and deficits and teach voters that the goal of fiscal policy is not always and everywhere to make deficits smaller. Our failure to do this has cost us dearly in recent decades, and now would be a good time to start. So there's all of that article. Let's see. I'm going to add this to my notes to put into the video description. Let's see here. And put the link there. Yeah, let me not skip double. Alright. So the next article is, let me see, what is it? This next article is related to the PayGo rule, because one of the things that PayGo will stop or hamper, or at least put an obstacle up for, is the proposed Green New Deal. This article comes from The Hill. It was published on the 2nd of January. House Democrats formalize climate committee plans without Green New Deal language. House Democrats have formally proposed creating a new committee on climate change without many of the main factors that progressives wanted in the panel's structure. Democratic leaders unveiled the plans for the Select Committee on Climate Crisis late Tuesday as part of a package of rules to govern House proceedings for the next 2 years. The proposed rules, which the House will vote to adopt Thursday, when Democrats formally take the chamber's majority, say the Select Committee is instructed to, quote, to investigate, study, make findings, and develop recommendations on political strategies and innovations, on policies, strategies, and innovations to achieve substantial and permanent reductions in pollution and other activities that contribute to the climate crisis, which will honor our responsibility to the good stewards of the planet, to be good stewards of the planet for future generations, end quote. As has been reported in recent weeks, the panel will not have many of the features that Representative-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democrat of New York, dozens of other Democrats, and hundreds of activists have asked for to lead to a Green New Deal. Hundreds, my ass, thousands. The panel will not have the power to subpoena or depose, nor will it have the authority to vote on legislation and send it directly to the House floor for a vote. It also is not being explicitly charged with developing Green New Deal legislation, which supporters envision as bringing the country to 100% renewable electricity and decarbonizing major industries over 10 years, as well as a universal jobs guarantee and other ideas. Now, this thing about not having subpoena or power to subpoena or depose and things like that, those were part of the committee it's replacing, so why take the power away now? Nonetheless, Representative Kathy Castor, Democrat of Florida, who likely Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, designated chairwoman of the Select Committee, said the Green New Deal will inspire the panel's work. She told The Hill last month, quote, "There's some fabulous proposals in the Green New Deal, and I'm excited about all that. You may see some similar language. Clearly, the focuses are going to be the same. This will be a committee clearly in the spirit of the Green New Deal," end quote. Horseshit. The woman doesn't even want to prohibit people from being on the committee who take contributions from the fossil fuel industry, so they will, be bought and paid for to kill any meaningful climate legislation. Or recommendations, I should say, since they can't introduce legislation even. What a crock of shit. Yes, and so here we go, what I just said. The Climate Committee also will not prohibit from its roles lawmakers who have accepted campaign donations from the fossil fuel industry, another request from Green New Deal supporters. Progressives have lauded Pelosi and other leaders for the panel, but expressed disappointment that it wouldn't be as strong as they had hoped. Let's see. Corbin Trent, a spokesman for Ocasio-Cortez, told The Hill last week, quote, "This committee, if it turns out that the rumors about it are true, sounds about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. As it's portrayed, it's going to be completely incapable of solving the greatest threat to humankind," end quote. Blah, 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 blah. So, let me go ahead and add this one also to my notes. And I'm going to have a look into the external chat here in just a moment. So if anyone has any comments or questions, I will be looking at those momentarily before I proceed to the next article. Let's see, I just got to make sure that I've got everything here ready for the video description. Alright, now let me see what you guys are up to out there. Hello, Devin Jones, how are you? I don't know if you're still here. That was, oh, it was just a minute ago apparently, so maybe you are still here. Hello, and welcome. I am talking about PayGo, among other things, today. So how are things at the Sparks Tribune? Would you like to come in and discuss any of the things I've been talking about? Maybe give me some update on how things are going with you and the Sparks Tribune? Devin is the owner of the Sparks Tribune. For those who don't know, it is an online news outlet which I link occasionally in the Discord and elsewhere. I've tweeted out some articles from them, shared some articles to the Google Plus communities, and occasionally to Facebook. Certainly do share them in my Discord server, which, again, a reminder for those watching, we do have a Discord server for my subscribers, so if you're interested in joining and taking part, the link for the Discord server is in the video description. I post a lot more news and other stuff in the Discord than I do on any other platform or all other platforms combined. Alright then, Devin. So if you're interested in hopping in, maybe I can bring you in after I go through the news. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go through the rest of the news articles that I have here. So, if you're interested in joining the show in a bit, you can hop into the Antechamber voice channel, and I will drag you into the streaming channel. And we're going to continue to talk about PayGo at this point. The next article I have comes from Paste Magazine. And it says, it was published on the 3rd of January. It's by Jacob Windling. It says, why are Democrats backing a PayGo rule that will make liberal legislation harder to pass? Well, I can tell you, but I'll get to it. The United States Congress has a litany of arcane and complicated rules that make it very difficult to understand exactly what the hell is going on. There are rules about procedures, budgeting, and all sorts of limitations around the legislative process, and some of these rules are only understood by a handful of experts. Our system is designed to be slow, which brings me to today's topic of confusion, PayGo. Despite pressure from progressive Democrats, the House rules package for the 116th Congress will include a pay-as-you-go provision requiring all new spending to be offset with either budget cuts or tax increases, a conservative policy aimed at tying the hands of government. It's not a conservative policy, it's a right-wing policy, but nevertheless. And yes, there is a difference. with one of them being about economics and one of them being about attitudes toward change in society. No matter how many times the Republicans want to use the term fiscal conservatism, there's no fucking such thing. It's just extreme right-wing bullshit. If they were actually conservative, they would give a damn about the environment, because, you know, conserving our natural resources and things like that. Yeah, that used to be something conservatives actually gave a damn about, but ever since the term conservative began to be used as a synonym for right-wing nutjob, they don't seem to care about that anymore. Oh no, we gotta make sure that our wealthy people get wealthier, no matter how bad it hurts the rest of us, huh? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who will be sworn in this week to represent a district in New York, will vote against the package, her spokesperson told The Intercept. Ro Khanna, Democrat from California, representative, announced Wednesday that he would oppose it. Presumptive House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who will be sworn in on Thursday, has promised for months to restore the PayGo rule, which she instituted when first taking over the Speaker's gavel in 2007. She ran into resistance from progressives who believed that the rule would make it more difficult for Democrats to pass a host of liberal agenda items, from Medicare for all to a Green New Deal to tuition-free public college. None of that is liberal. That's all progressive. Democrats also argue that PayGo creates an unlevel playing field. Critics also argue where Republicans get to blow giant holes in the tax code, as they did with the 2017 tax cuts, while Democrats must pay fealty to the deficit. That said, this is not your simple, here goes the Republicans again kind of story. Ilhan Omar, a new congresswoman joining Khanna and Ocasio-Cortez in the Progressive Caucus, will vote for the new rules, which contain the PayGo provision. According to Representative Omar, quote, "I am pleased that the rules package will include important reforms I helped negotiate, including the elimination of the supermajority vote requirement, which would limit our ability to raise the revenue necessary to fund important priorities like healthcare, education, and green jobs, as well as the clarification that religious headdresses can be worn in the House chamber. I continue to have concerns about the inclusion of pay-as-you-go or PayGo, but I am pleased that Chairman McGovern and House leadership have assured us that the rule will not be used to block key progressive priorities in Congress. Budgets are an expression of our values. Going forward, I support legislation to reform PayGo and am committed to pursuing reforms that allow us to center our policies on people's everyday needs rather than artificial constraints. I want to thank Progressive Caucus co-chairs Mark Pocan and Pramila Jayapal for their leadership on this issue." End quote. So what's going on here? Why are progressives like Ro Khanna and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opposing this PayGo rule, while other progressives like Ilhan Omar and Pramila Jayapal support it? Oh, buddy, just because I call myself Mary Queen of Scots doesn't mean you have to call me Your Royal Highness. You know, you can call yourself anything you want. Actions speak louder than words. So, we'll see whether Omar and Jayapal are actually progressive, or if they're just more progressive opportunists. The short answer is politics. You're not going to win every battle, and progressives won plenty before this, as The Intercept Ryan Grun wrote in his newsletter, in quote, "Over the past several weeks, progressives fought Pelosi for several different things. They wanted proportional representation for congressional progressive caucus members on A committees, and they won that. They wanted to overturn the stupid rule that required a 3/5 vote for tax increases, and they won that. They wanted to get rid of PayGo and lost that, so they pocketed their wins and agreed to it rather than risk what they'd gotten. And they also said they were given assurances that PayGo would be waived before it blocked major progressive policy, which raises the obvious question, then why the hell is it there? End quote. So, I mean, this article goes on a bit longer. Let's see here. The billionaires who actually run this country love austerity politics, and they do everything they can to put roadblocks in front of any program that could redistribute some of their wealth. PayGo is a perfect example of the broken way the donor class thinks, and any party that considers itself truly liberal would never impose such an arduous rule, especially during a time where we need to make major investments in healthcare, our economy, and in the fight against climate change. The simple fact of the matter is that if we have to pay for the entire fight against climate change up front, then we will lose the battle against the apocalypse. But how arduous is PayGo really? Here's the central problem with figuring out what is going on. Congress can and has change or ignore the rules at a whim. Say that the Green New Deal came up for a vote in the House, Nancy Pelosi could include a provision in the bill that waives the PayGo rule, and this entire fight would recede into the background. This is likely why Ilhan Omar is backing the rules package, and what she means when she said she received assurances that PayGo will not be used to stop progressive legislation. But that still doesn't answer the question of why we need PayGo in the first place. Why are Democrats seemingly voting to constrain their policy before it has even begun? Nancy Pelosi's Deputy Chief of Staff explained their position, quote, "We must replace cut-go to allow Democrats to designate appropriate offsets, including revenue increases. A vote against the Democratic rules package is a vote to let Mick Mulvaney make across-the-board cuts, unilaterally reversing Democratic initiatives and funding increases." End quote. So, I mean, this is a false dilemma. This is a bifurcation fallacy. It's either cut, go, or pay, go. No, we didn't always have either one of those rules. We can get rid of both of them. Duh. So the article goes on and goes on, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not going to read the rest of it. But I will, as usual, include the link in the video description so you can check out the article in full for yourself later on. Some of these articles do have graphs and charts, some of them have videos, and some of them have, images of various levels of interest or not. So, I mean, do please go and check out the articles on your own later if you're interested, if you be interested. Let's see here. I'm going to put this into the notes, copy that link, and there we go. Alright, so the next article that I have, and is from In These Times again. And this one is a very interesting one, I think. This was published on the 3rd by Pavlina R. Cherneva, Chernea, who is Cherneva? Yeah, I don't know. I can't read it with the underscore in the way. I think it's Cherneva, and I've seen certainly work by this woman before. She is an advocate of modern monetary theory, which is not a theory in the ordinary sense of the word, but more theory in the scientific sense of the word. It is an empirical description of how our money works. It's not some speculation or new idea. It's decades old and actually was first expressed back in the 1940s by Fed Chairman Rummel. Some people would, and there are different takes on MMT or modern monetary theory. Some of us are kind of post-Keynesian in our approach to MMT. But anyway, Pavlina says PayGo is based on a fallacy. The U.S. government can dramatically increase spending without raising taxes. No government checks bounce, ever. There is nothing more crippling to a bold policy agenda than the myth that the government can run out of money. This myth is behind every, but how will you pay for it, objection to proposals such as a Green New Deal and Medicare for All. New House Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, has even proposed instituting self-defeating PayGo, pay-as-you-go rules, which would require all new government spending to be matched with increased revenue, wrongly prioritizing the balancing of the budget over the well-being of the people, of the public. Dispelling this myth is at the heart of an economic approach that is rapidly gaining a global following known as modern monetary theory, MMT. MMT stresses that in the modern world where government-backed currencies are no longer backed by gold or other commodities, federal governments can't run out of financial resources. United States, unlike states and municipalities which have hard constraints on spending, for the federal government, all funding shortages are artificially created. Understanding this changes everything from the economic possibilities before us to what the public can demand from our government. Everyone knows that only governments can issue currencies, dollars, yen, pesos. Now, there are a couple of nut jobs who claim that the government doesn't do this, but I ranted about them last night, so yes, they do. The government does issue our dollars. It's not issued by private banks. I'm sorry, guys, but you need to get your heads out of that archaic notion or wrong-headed notion or whatever it is. I don't know where you came up with this idea. Anyway, to continue, if households tried to do it, we'd be called counterfeiters. It should be obvious then that the sole issuer of a currency cannot possibly run out of it. But as Sherlock Holmes once observed, quote, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact, end quote. The public understanding of government spending is a classic case of cognitive dissonance. We regularly witness how the government immediately finds the money when the policy priority is an endless war, financial bailouts, billionaire tax cuts, and yet the public is generally convinced that, like a household, the government can go broke, if not today, maybe tomorrow, if it does not raise enough tax revenue to pay its bills. Debt limits set by Congress create the appearance that taxes and bonds finance the government. But if we follow the money, as MMT economists have done, we find that the federal government does not spend tax revenue. Just listen to Federal Reserve officials here, and here. There are links there. And it cannot possibly default. And another link. There are several links in this article. I highly recommend you check it out when I finish and have the links in the video description. So where does this money come from? In practice, government funding is voted into existence every time Congress appropriates a budget for a given program. Afterward, the Federal Reserve, the monopoly issuer of dollar reserves, and the Treasury, the monopoly issuer of coins and bonds, coordinate to clear all payments. No government checks bounce, ever. What this also means is that when the government runs a deficit and spends more than it takes in through taxes, it is adding dollars to the economy. And while politicians vilify the deficits, when politically convenient, the public fails to spot that all the money spent by government, except for that which is later taxed, lives in some person or firm's bank account or wallet. If we balanced the budget, we would also remove those funds. Even those who understand this often resist bold government action for fear of inflation. And while MMT agrees that inflation is a relevant worry, we can avoid the inflation trap by focusing on how the government spends rather than how much. So long as money put into the economy is mobilizing unemployed resources and satisfying unmet basic needs, government spending can be done without causing inflation and is in fact desperately needed. By highlighting the flexible and vast spending powers of the state, MMT opens new possibilities for solving our most pressing economic problems. The U.S. government debt and deficit are not among them. A clean environment, good jobs, and affordable education are in short supply. Green pieces of paper or digits in a bank are not. The bottom line, how will you pay for it, is the wrong question to obsess over. The right question is the more difficult and important one about the impact of government spending on the economy. Did it generate income inequality? Did it cause inflation? Or did it help build an economy that works for all? MMT economists favor policies for shared prosperity, like a federal jobs guarantee, a Green New Deal, tuition-free college, and Medicare for all. What are the real effects of these and other policies on the economy? Let's have that debate. Pavlina R. Cherneva is Program Director and Associate Professor of Economics at Bard College and Research Associate at the Levy Economic Institute. Now, Bard College and the Levy Economic Institute, that's Cambridge University, okay? Cambridge University in England, right? Do you understand now why claiming that reputable economists don't support MMT is absolutely ludicrous? Cambridge University. You think they let disreputable hacks like, let's say, Norman Fell or Zechariah Sitkin come and be lecturers or run any of their programs or anything of the sort? Even a visiting scholar? No. But Stephanie Bell, now Stephanie Kelton, was a visiting scholar at Cambridge at the Levy Institute of Bard College. Yeah. So don't feed me any more crap about reputable and respected authorities on economics, blah, blah, blah. When we have people at Cambridge, yeah, I'm sorry, guys, but you're arguing the wrong thing to the wrong person because I know better. Alright, so let me add that to the, let me add that article to the, geez, where the heck is it? Here we go. I'm gonna put the archive link also for this one because there was some difficulty I had getting this to open from the link that I had sent to myself. But I'm going to give you the actual link to the article at In These Times, as well as the link to an archived copy of the article at archive.is, just in case you can't get the original to open with the link. I don't know what the issue was with that. It may have just been a temporary glitch or whatever. It was telling me that I might need to clear my cookies or enable cookies or something. And no, I don't need to enable my cookies. I didn't reject cookies from this site, so it should be working. All right, now before, oh no, wait, and I'm gonna read to you a tweet from Rashida Tlaib. This was posted, I believe, yesterday. Yeah. So, this is one of the newly elected so-called progressives to the U.S. Congress. She is a Democrat. And so she posted this yesterday on Twitter. Quote, "This is not just about Donald Trump. This is about all of us. In the face of this constitutional crisis, we must rise." End quote. Now, before I go on, I'm going to point out she's one of the people who voted for PayGo, and instead of saying anything about that, she's going to impeach the motherfucker, as she said, and people got all up in a tither about her saying the F word. Oh, how scandalous. A sitting representative used the profanity. Oh my goodness. Well, grow the hell up. People use profanity all the time. It's done. You know, it's done. People do it, and there's nothing wrong with it, contrary to your stupidity, which is based on socioeconomic snobbery and linguistic prejudice that first arose in the year AD 1066, when the Normans invaded England and conquered. For the next 200 years, no king of England spoke English, and they looked down their noses at the common people and their common tongue, which was Old English. You know what the word common is in Latin? Vulgar. That's where we get the entire concept of vulgarity in English-speaking cultures. It comes from this socioeconomic snobbery and cultural linguistic prejudice on the part of the Normans toward the native Old English, the native Anglo-Saxons, Frisians, and Utes who spoke Old English. So there's nothing moral about it, and there's certainly nothing ethical about it. Get over yourselves. But anyway, in response to this tweet she sent about, we got to get rid of Donald Trump, I responded, Donald Trump, contrary to the mainstream media and partisan Democrat propaganda, is not out of character, not a radical departure from the business as usual of the past 40 years, regardless of whether the administration in power had a D or an R next to its name. You voted for PayGo, and that is a greater crisis than anything the big orange blowhard has done. PayGo is based on Reagan-esque lies, fear-mongering over the deficit because Democrats don't have the spine to stand up to smears from the Republicans like that tax and spend propaganda from years ago. The U.S. federal government is the issuer of a sovereign, free-floating, non-convertible fiat currency. It does not need to tax or borrow in order to fund spending. It cannot become insolvent in its own currency and is only constrained in spending by resources of which we have more than enough to cover everything that we need, including a Green New Deal and a Green New Deal with federal jobs guarantee. National improved and expanded Medicare for all, basic income for those unable to work, and much, much more. I mean, seriously, our gross domestic product is very strong. We are producing more than enough resources. We've got a number of people unemployed. Anyway, I continued to reply to her. If you were an authentic modern progressive, you would never have caved to vote for PayGo. But instead of doing what is right for the American people, you want to engage in a symbolic gesture of battling against Donald Trump as if he were in any way scary. Guess what happens if you do remove him from office? President Pence. Do those words sound good together? This push to impeach Donald Trump is nothing but political circus. Now, where's our bread? Remember, bread and circuses? You can't give us just circuses. You have to give us bread, too. But as we go marching, you know how this ends. Bread and roses. Not bread and circuses. We don't want your circus. We want bread and roses. But you voted for PayGo to make sure that we get neither bread nor roses. Oh, and you said the F word. My, oh my, how brave. I say it all the time, but I don't say it as part of a distraction from real issues. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you want to see that, you can go to my Twitter account. It's at Giovanna Liviana. There you go. I'm going to, let's see here. Let me have a look into the chat and see what's going on out there. Yes. Tulsi did vote against the measure, and no, more dollars would not mean a less valuable dollar, and here's the reason why. It's really not a complicated thing, as Howard and Joe want to try to make it out to be. There's nothing complicated about this. It's pretty obvious. Okay, so 100 years ago, not even that long, but 100 years ago certainly, the United States was on the gold standard, and what that meant was that our currency was backed by gold reserves in Fort Knox. So you have all these gold bars in Fort Knox, and each dollar was worth a certain amount of gold. So let's just give a hypothetical example here. Let's say we have $1,000 in circulation, and we have 1,000 bars of gold in Fort Knox. If we have only 1,000 bars of gold and $1,000 in circulation, then each dollar is worth exactly one gold bar, or, theoretically. It's worth whatever the government wants to make it worth in terms of gold. They might not want to get rid of all of their gold, they want to keep some for reserve or whatever, but this is for the purposes of this hypothesis. We have 1,000 gold bars in Fort Knox and $1,000 in circulation. So each dollar is worth exactly one gold bar. Now let's say that we decide for some reason that we need to increase the amount of currency in circulation, which an example of the need for that or the desire for that would be to put more people to work, because if you don't have enough money in circulation, unemployment keeps going up as more people are born and grow up and become of age to work and so forth. So let's say we want to increase the amount of currency in circulation for whatever reason. Let's say we want to double it. So now we've got $2,000 in circulation, but we still only have 1,000 gold bars in Fort Knox. Now the only way to change that is to go out and dig up some more gold, but you got to find it first. Or you can buy some more gold from somebody else. But how are you going to pay for that when, you're going to pay them in dollars that are just redeemable in gold that that doesn't make a lot of sense. So anyway, so now we have, instead of $1,000 in circulation, we have $2,000 in circulation, but we still have 1,000 bars of gold in Fort Knox. Now each dollar bill is worth half of a gold bar, whereas before each dollar bill was worth an entire gold bar, a whole gold bar. But now each one is worth half of a gold bar. That is devaluing the currency by increasing the amount of currency in circulation, and it is inherent and necessary in the case of currency being backed by some physical commodity. If you have a limited amount of that commodity and you don't increase it, then increasing the amount of currency in circulation inherently and necessarily devalues that currency, and that means prices go up, and so you start talking about inflation and stuff like that. 1933, Franklin Roosevelt removed us from the gold standard temporarily. 1971, Richard Nixon removed us from the gold standard permanently. At the time, he also instituted wage and price controls. Now, I'm not big on wage controls, but price controls were a good thing too, just like getting us off the gold standard. And the reason getting us off the gold standard was a good thing is because it removed the chain from the dollar that was attached to the gold bar. So now we have no constraints on spending other than actual resources. And as long as the gross domestic product is strong, we have plenty of resources. So you don't need to worry about that. The only other reason that the dollar would become less valuable as a result of this would be due to simple human greed. When people start raising their prices because they want more of the wealth that is in circulation for no good reason. And I went over this before. I think it was last week. I talked about Martin Shkreli. Did he really need to increase the price of that drug by such an enormous amount? No. That was just greed on his part. So, I mean, did the cost of production of the drug increase? No. Did he hire more people? No. No, he just wanted more money. That was it. Greed. So price controls can help to control that. And I remember very well what happened when the price controls came off the petroleum industry in the late 70s under Carter. Boom! The so-called gas crisis and a bunch of made-up shit about OPEC. OPEC is doing this. It's not our fault. Oh, yes, it is your fault. You just want to raise prices. No, it's not, Lich, and you're a twit. MMT is an empirical accounting of the way our money actually works. I've given you a number of resources. I doubt you've read any of them. So, anyway, and again, as I just read from a woman who is the, what is it? She's at Cambridge University. Her name is Pavlina Cherneva. She's program director and associate professor of economics at Bard College and research associate at the Levy Economic Institute. The Levy Economic Institute is an institute in Bard College, and Bard College is one of the colleges of the University of Cambridge. Yes, that Cambridge, the one in England, the one that everyone holds up as a prestigious and reputable university along with Oxford. Yeah, that Cambridge. And she is an MMT person. Stephanie Bell was a visiting scholar at Cambridge at the Levy Institute. She's now known as Stephanie Kelton after she got married. So, you want to consult some reputable economists about it, or do you want to keep talking about how it's a cult or a religion or a scam? I think you would rather benefit by looking at the actual information from reputable economists at reputable institutions of higher education. So anyway, having just read that, let's see here. I have a couple of other. Okay, I'm gonna go on and I'm gonna read the next article I have is actually unrelated to MMT or PayGo, at least to some extent. And this comes from the Evening Standard. And where did I put it? I should have it here. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so from the Evening Standard by Sean Morrison. I'm not seeing a date on this, but it was recent. I printed it on the 4th, which was yesterday. And I don't see a date, but anyway. Brexit poll, huge blow for Theresa May as study reveals most Tory MPs prefer no deal to her plans. Theresa May's bid to get Tory MPs to back her Brexit plan has suffered a setback, as a new poll showed more than half of them prefer a no-deal withdrawal. Just 23% said they would said they would back the Prime Minister's deal. That's compared to 57% who said they would support leaving the EU without an agreement. A two-way referendum would see 29% of Tory members endorse Mrs. May's stance, with 64% suggesting they would vote for a no-deal scenario, according to the poll. The YouGov poll, funded by Economic and Social Research Council, comes at a crucial time for the Prime Minister as she faces a crunch vote on her plans in the Commons. Let's see. after she suddenly pulled a vote on the withdrawal agreement in December because it faced a significant defeat, MPs are to begin debating the proposals again next Wednesday. The vote is scheduled for the following week. Poll findings also came as Ms. May's Brexit agenda was hit by a series of blows. DUP Deputy Leader Nigel Dodds insisted his party's opposition to Irish border backstop proposals had not lessened after a meeting with the Prime Minister on Thursday. Mr. Dodds said, quote, "The withdrawal agreement, as currently proposed, flies in the face of the government's commitments on Northern Ireland as we leave the EU," end quote. However, Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar insisted there could be no changes to the backstop, which is intended to prevent a hard border in Ireland by ensuring the UK abides by EU customs rules if no trade deal is agreed by the end of a Brexit transition period. Mr. Varadkar said he had spoken to German Chancellor Angela Merkel by telephone on Thursday, and the two leaders agreed to stand by the Brexit deal. He said, quote, "We're happy to offer reassurances and guarantees to the UK, but not reassurances and guarantees that contradict or change what was agreed back in November," end quote. And as the EU closed ranks, the European Commission confirmed, quote, "No further meetings are foreseen," end quote, with the UK on updating Mrs. May's Brexit deal because negotiations have concluded. Ms. May is pressing European leaders for more flexibility on the Irish backstop as a way of garnering more backbench support for her exit plans. So there is that. Let's see here. I'm going to add this also to the video description so you can check that out later if you like. And now, let's see. I have, I think, 3 more articles. Let me just have a look at the time here. Yeah, we've got time to go through these articles, I believe, and still be within the 2-hour time frame that I have arbitrarily set for myself. Because, I mean, I think last week I went on for 4 hours or so, or no, I think it was like almost 3 hours, and wound up with about 2 hours of it actually showing up on the YouTube channel for whatever reason. So I'd rather, I mean, there are times when I can stream for 3 or 4 hours and the whole stream comes out perfect and there's no buffering and no interruptions and no disconnections. And then there are other times when, for no apparent reason, I have all kinds of challenges. So, let's see. Anything going on? Yeah, well, it does add up. It does hold up because what is it that you think doesn't hold up, Tommaso? I mean, Stephanie Kelton thought it was wrong too, and then went and did her own thing to investigate, and she was going to prove Warren Mosler wrong. And when she got to the end of it, she realized he was right. He just left out some of the steps that she included. He skipped steps, but she included them in her attempt to disprove his ideas and found out he was right. So, I'll give you a moment to come up with a response to that, because the next article I'm going to read, I believe the next article I'm going to read will also be talking to some extent about PayGo, and I believe it talks about MMT. I'm not sure. I'll have to look. Or I guess we'll see as I read it. But don't run away expecting this entire stream to be about MMT, because I do have some science to talk about as well. Recent scientific discovery, which I found interesting, and I think you might as well, Tommaso, since you're into life sciences and that sort of thing. First camping of the day. Alright, I don't see a reply from you, so I'm going to proceed to the next article, which is this one is rather long, as I recall, but it's very interesting. This was published on Medium by Matt Stoller on the 3rd. Congressional Staffing for Dummies, the PayGo Dispute. There are a lot of people arguing about this thing called PayGo. Here's my attempted explanation of what PayGo is and how it intersects with stuff you care about. In order to understand the conflict, which seems on the surface quite simple, you have to understand a bunch of things about congressional process and budgeting. So let's start with PayGo itself. What is it? PayGo stands for Pay As You Go, budgeting, a concept that in theory means that bills Congress pass need to be deficit neutral. That is, each proposed program or law, if it costs money, should also bring in an equal amount of money through either taxes or other budget cuts. This is what's known among centrists, so-called centrists anyway, in Washington, D.C., and frankly among most Americans as fiscal responsibility. A balanced budget by the government requires that you bring in as much as you spend. Well, now that I've gotten through the basics, here's what the fight is about. In 2010, the Obama administration and a Democratic Congress passed a law to ensure Congress would be fiscally responsible. Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker in 2010 when Congress passed the statute, and she is proud of being fiscally responsible. This law says that if Congress doesn't go through a PayGo process for its aggregate spending and taxing in the full fiscal year, the White House's Office of Management and Budget gets to choose a bunch of programs to cut in a process known as sequestration. Sequestration is in law. It was a law that sort of made sense at the time because Obama was president and Democrats didn't so much mind if a democratically controlled OMB got to make a bunch of important decisions. But guess what? Trump is now president, which means he's the one that gets to decide the cuts that happen if Congress doesn't use a PayGo decision-making process. I'm going to pause right here just to point out, Republicans and Democrats constantly approve bullshit that everybody tells them is a bad idea, and they're like, well, yeah, but we're in power. Well, you're not going to be in power forever. I hate to break it to you, but neither one of you parties will be in power forever. So, I mean, it switches back and forth between the two of you right now, but there have been other parties in the past, and there will be other parties in the future. So what happens when you're not in power and the party you hate is in power? I'm not going to say the party that is the opposite of you or that disagrees with you, because frankly that's bullshit. We all know that they are bought by the same corporate oligarchs. But let's say you institute some kind of ministry of propaganda, as Obama did not too long ago. and making it legal for the United States government to spread propaganda among the citizens. And I'm not exaggerating, that did happen. Now what happens a few months later when Trump takes office? Oh my goodness, now Trump's got the power to spread propaganda. Now you don't like it so much, do you? But it was fine while Obama was able to do it. Oh, but we can't have Trump doing that. Well, dude, you shouldn't have passed the goddamn law in the first place. I tried to warn you. I said this about the Patriot Act, too. But did anybody listen? No. I even told my senator, I know very well this is all about the oil, and I don't want us going to war in Iraq either. You know, but, yeah, anyway. I got back a form response. That was, dear so-and-so, thank you for your opinion, but I'm going to do whatever the fuck my party and my donors want anyway. So I wrote back to her and addressed her by her first name instead of calling her senator or whatever, and gave her a nice little, very unladylike response. And I never heard from her again. Yeah, no great loss though. She's no longer in office here, so yeah. Anyway, to continue, he's going to actually provide a quote of the relevant statute, and so this is quote, if the annual report issued at the end of a session of Congress under subsection A shows a debit on either PayGo scorecard for the budget year, OMB shall prepare and the President shall issue and include in that report a sequestration order that, upon issuance, shall reduce budgetary resources of direct spending programs by enough to offset that debit as prescribed in Section 6, end quote. To conform to this law, the House had a rule to emphasize the importance of fiscal responsibility. Rules are different from laws. A law is usually a statute that applies to society and must be passed by both houses and signed by the President. A House rule is the mechanism by which the House itself operates. Kind of the rules by which you run a meeting, like Robert's Rules of Order. Each body of Congress has its own internal set of rules. For instance, you may have heard of the filibuster in the Senate. That opportunity to block legislation with a small number of votes is a result of a Senate rule. And those rules are rarely changed. House rules are very different. They are set by majority vote and can be changed at any time. The Republicans had a House rule similar PayGo, but it's called CutGo. This rule said essentially that you can never ever raise taxes and that all new spending has to be offset by other spending cuts. In 2018, Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats said they wanted to emphasize that they, unlike Republicans, were fiscally responsible. So she pledged to go back to the PayGo rule, both to conform to the 2010 statute and because she's proud of being fiscally, she's proud being fiscally responsibility. What the hell? Okay. She made another change to emphasize that Democrats, unlike Republicans, were friends of the people. The Republicans had a rule saying that a tax hike required not just a majority vote of House members, but a 60% vote. Pelosi said she would change this rule and make it apply only to tax hikes that hit the bottom 80% of the tax-paying public. The middle class isn't going to have their taxes raised under the Democrats, or so the thinking went. So that's where things stood until progressives got involved. We have a law we can't change without the House, Senate, and the President agreeing, but we also have a rule that the House majority can itself change at any point. Now this is where it gets a bit weird. You see, the House has a rules package at the beginning of its session, but it also changes its rules pretty much every legislative day through what's called the Rules Committee. Every time the House puts forward a bill to vote on the floor, it has to first vote on a rule for that bill. Floor time is extremely valuable because you need floor time to pass a bill. Rules structure how floor time is used, and every rule must go through the Rules Committee. A typical House rule will say, here's the bill that's being voted on, here's who gets to talk on the floor, here are the amendments that get a vote, here's how much time to dedicate, etc. But a House rule can also change or waive any other rule at any point, including rules put forward at the beginning of the House term, like PayGo. The Republicans, for instance, waived the cut-go rule to pass the Trump tax cuts, and rules are routinely waived on or changed when there is legislation for emergencies like war bailouts, disaster relief, or anything else Congress dubs an emergency. So in reality, anything put forward like PayGo is basically symbolic, and all that really matters is who runs the Rules Committee and what he or she had for lunch that day. The Rules Committee used to be nicknamed the Speaker's Committee because the Speaker stacks the committee with his or her cronies, so he or she can control what's voted on. The head of Rules is Jim McGovern, close ally of Pelosi and a guy with a generally good reputation. McGovern hates PayGo and is in the Progressive Caucus, but the argument is that if you get rid of PayGo outright without getting rid of the 2010 law, then this automatically kicks sequestration budgetary cutting authority to Trump. If you keep PayGo but just waive it on every bill, then that authority doesn't go to Trump. And it goes on, and I mean, one of the things that someone was trying to say was, well, we are either going to have PayGo or CutGo. No, again, that is a bifurcation fallacy. CutGo and PayGo have not always been rules in the House. There have been times when neither one of those was a rule. So it's not a question of you either have to have one or you get the other. You can get rid of both of them. Now, I understand this business about the sequestration law and all that jazz, but again, Democrats are going to not have the spine, as usual, even when they get a majority in both houses of Congress, if they ever succeed in doing that again, which is by no means a certainty. So I'm probably going to have to cut this short pretty quick, but I do want to read at least one more of these articles. I don't know if I have caught something or if I'm just having a sinus issue or allergies or what, but my throat is a bit raw and I'm quite stuffed up. So, I mean, I'm going to include another, let's see here. Well, I've only got 2 more articles to read. But I do have something here. According to what I've been told, Representative Jayapal has introduced legislation to repeal the PayGo statute. And this is from yesterday. Today, Representative Pramila Jayapal, co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, introduced H.R. 242 to repeal the Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. Statutory pay-as-you-go or PayGo is currently law. To truly eliminate it, we have to change the law. Modifying the rules package is not enough. Let's see here. Other original co-sponsors include Pocan McGovern, Cana Ocasio-Cortez, Nadler, Lee, Velasquez, Pingree, Raskin, Espaillat, Shakovsky, Clark, Grijalva, Serrano, and Gomez. Tulsi Gabbard's name was not on there as of yesterday, but I will point out, as Devin mentioned in the external text chat, it wasn't just Ro Khanna and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who voted against PayGo. It was also Tulsi Gabbard. So there you go. A thumbs up for Tulsi and Ocasio and Ro. But I do have two more articles. This next article comes from the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, and it says, it's a brilliant title too. Austerity is theft, the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to the rich since the enclosures. Austerity is theft. That's a wonderful response to all the objectivists and neo-objectivists and ANCAPs going on about how they believe that taxation is theft. No, it's not. It really isn't. We live in a society, and that means you have responsibilities as well as privileges and rights. You can't just take. You also have to give. Otherwise, get out of this society and go somewhere else. Anyway, this is published on the 4th of January, 2019. And it says, it's by Fouad Alakbarov, an Azerbaijani Scottish human rights activist, political commentator, and humanitarian. In the week before Christmas, the Secretary of State for Housing claimed that the skyrocketing levels of homelessness were down to social issues and had nothing to do with the government's housing policy. Then, just a few days later, George Osborne added his pennorth, dismissing outright the link between his punitive austerity program and Britain's homelessness crisis, saying, quote, "It's not a lack of money that's not a consequence of austerity. That's just a consequence of bad policy," end quote. When interviewed on BBC Radio 4's Today program, he went on to argue that poverty would have been worse without austerity. He suggested that when the Tories had come to power in 2010, the country was close to bankruptcy, and that the public spending cuts were necessary to get the country back on its feet. Within these words lie two dishonest and harmful narratives which have pervaded the public consciousness for decades and form the basis for people's understanding of the world they inhabit. They have set us on the road to a divided and unequal society. Firstly, the ideological narrative that competition defines the human race, and thus the individual is responsible for his or her own fortune. It applies the biological evolutionary language of Darwin to the functioning of the economy and society. It posits that the state has no role to play in delivering public purpose and well-being, and that it should not interfere in what is conceived to be a natural process of the survival of the fittest, whereby the most motivated, strongest, and powerful win. It rejects outright the concept of mutual aid and cooperation as being fundamental to human and planetary thriving. The political elites and the Fourth Estate have consistently demonized poor people, the sick, and those with disabilities by the use of inflammatory language to create division both across and within the social classes. The constant reference by politicians and journalists to strivers and hardworking families is an example. Or the provocative words of George Osborne, who said, quote, "Where is the fairness, we ask, for the shift worker leaving home in the dark hours of the early morning who looks up at the closed blinds of their next-door neighbors sleeping off a life on benefits," end quote. Such images perpetuate hate, encourage violence, justify selfishness, and a sense of entitlement, as well drive the notion that personal fulfillment trumps the interests of the collective. Now, if you recall, I did read the article about Star, what's her name, babbling about people on food stamps, looking at porn, and who cares, who cares? Secondly, the narrative that austerity was necessary to get the government's accounts back into balance, and that its role was to be fiscally responsible so as to not burden future generations with debt. In 2010 and following George Osborne's spending review, Will Hutton noted that never before has a country with such a large economy carrying so much private debt taken the experience of near financial collapse to squeeze its budget with such severity and speed, end quote. The tried and tested Keynesian economics of fiscal spending were abandoned in a frenzy of cuts to public services, local government, and welfare. The notion that the state money system was one great big household budget was invoked by deficit hawk economists and politicians alike, and reference made to Liam Burns' note left in the Treasury that there was no money left. Repeated allusions were made to paying down the state credit cards, taking the nation back from bankruptcy, and the wisdom of living within one's means. George Osborne's cuts drove deep, cutting 81 billion pounds from government spending on the NHS, welfare, higher education, social housing, policing, and local government, to lead to the loss of over 500,000 jobs. He vowed to restore, quote, sanity to our public finances and stability to our economy, end quote. Using these false analogies, the Conservatives were able to justify their cuts to public services, the selling off of public assets and privatization of public services, the paring down of the welfare state to bare bones to kick away the foundation stones of civil society. Not for any financial imperative, but because they made a political choice to do so. Contrary to George Osborne's claim that austerity was vital for the health of the economy, the consequences have proved calamitous. Every day, the evidence piles up from overstretched hospitals, failing social care, crumbling infrastructure, the tragic personal stories of those affected by changes to benefits which have led to suffering and death, increased homelessness and death on the streets of Britain, hunger and the growth of food banks, closures of high street shops, and a deteriorating economy. And yet every day, government ministers shamelessly deny responsibility for the harm they are causing, claiming that their policies are successful and defending their economic record. In 1845, Friedrich Engels coined the phrase social murder, whereby the class which holds social and political control places citizens in such a position that they inevitably meet an early or unnatural death, murder committed not by one individual against another, but by the political elite against the poorest in society. 173 years on, Dr. Chris Grover from Lancaster University, in a recently published report, accuses the political elites of the same as a direct consequence of austerity and cuts to benefits, which he says can be viewed as a form of structural violence that is built into society and is expressed in unequal power and unequal life chances as it deepens inequalities and injustices and creates even more poverty, end quote. He suggests that, quote, as a result of austerity, working class people face harm to their physical and mental well-being and in some instances are socially murdered, end quote. People are not suffering and dying because of their own personal failings. They are dying as victims of an ideology which has promoted austerity as a financial necessity when in fact it is the worst prescription of all. Umer Haik describes it as a force that is ripping the world apart, slashing through democracy, the future, and society, reducing the planet to a smoking wreck. George Osborne boasted that austerity was necessary to save the economy by driving down deficits and the national debt, never mind the fact it is our savings, or that the government, as the currency issuer, can always settle its pound-denominated liabilities. This deliberate deception disguised its real purpose, which was always about demolishing public services to shift the public narrative to acceptance of privatization. In this respect, it was shameful that Manchester University appointed the architect of Tory austerity as an honorary professor of economics. In so doing, it thoroughly insults all those who have suffered as a result of his unnecessary and harmful economic policies, as well as discredits even further those subscribing to economic orthodoxy within the teaching profession. Its decision to legitimize a man who has caused so much pain and suffering should have been called into question. Such servile behavior in a seat of supposed learning was distasteful and has proved to be an odious appointment as his austerity chickens come home to roost. It is now time for the people to contest the lies and the cruel deception practiced by ideologically driven politicians. Firstly, by recognizing that nothing is set in stone and that there is an alternative to austerity. Secondly, by opening our eyes to the painful realities of cuts to public services and Social Security, whereby people are suffering and dying as a result. And thirdly, by getting to grips with how money works and the currency issuing nature of sovereign governments, governments which need neither to tax nor to borrow to spend, and whose limitations are not money but the real resources available to it to deliver its policies. The truth is that government spending into the economy injects money into the purses and bank accounts of public sector workers, who then take their earnings and spend them directly into the real economy, pay down their debts, or save. In fact, a healthy economy depends on people spending. It depends on sales of goods and services. To give an example, every £1 spent by government on the NHS will generate around £4.30 of spending as wages circulate around the economy. By cutting public spending, austerity has had the reverse effect, which has led to soaring of unsustainable private debt and a downward economic spiral for all but the rich. Once we grasp the essential truths of monetary realities, we will be able to see the wood for the trees and recognize that the role of government is not to balance the budget, but to balance the economy. Only in this way can we create a fairer, equitable, and more sustainable world. So, yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay. You know what? I'm just going to call it austerity is theft. Okay, how about that? That'll work for me. Yeah. Austerity is theft will be in the video description momentarily, I think. Let's try this here. And so I have one final article, which is an article about a recent scientific discovery, which I think might be of some interest to some of you, and was certainly interesting to me. So let's see, what is it? This This comes from Scientific American. Let's see, where is it? No. Where the heck is it? Oh, no, tell me. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Okay, so this is, as I said, from Scientific American. It was published on the 28th of December, 2018 in Quanta magazine. And it's by Jonathan Lambert. What a newfound kingdom means for the tree of life. Neither animal, plant, fungus, nor familiar protozoan, a strange microbe, foretells incredible biodiversity yet to be discovered. The tree of life just got another major branch. Researchers recently found a certain rare and mysterious microbe called a hemimastigote in a clump of Nova Scotian soil. Their subsequent analysis of its DNA revealed that it was neither animal, plant, fungus, nor any recognized type of protozoan, that it in fact fell far outside any of the known large categories for classifying complex forms of life, eukaryotes. Instead, this flagella-waving oddball stands as the first member of its own supra-kingdom group, which probably peeled away from the other big branches of life at least 1 billion years ago. Alistair Simpson, a microbiologist at Dalhousie University who led the study, says, quote, "It's the sort of result you hope to see once in a career," end quote. Impressive as this finding about hemimastigotes is on its own, what matters more is that it's just the latest and most profound of a quietly and steadily growing number of major taxonomic additions. Researchers keep uncovering not just new species or classes, but entirely new kingdoms of life, raising questions about how they have stayed hidden for so long and how close we are to finding them all. Jana Egglet is a Dalhousie graduate student dedicated to discovering novel lineages of the single-cell eukaryotes called protists. While hiking in Nova Scotia on a cold spring day in 2016, she fell back from her friends to scrape a few grains of dirt into a plastic tube. Such impromptu soil sampling, she said, is, quote, "a professional hazard," end quote. Back in the lab, Egglet soaked her sample in water, and over the next month, she periodically peeked at it through a microscope for signs of unusual life. Late one evening, something odd in the sample caught her eye. An elongated cell radiating whip-like flagella was, quote, "awkwardly swimming as though it didn't realize it had all these flagella that could help it move," end quote, Egglet said. Under a more powerful scope, she saw it fit the description of a hemimastigote, a rare kind of protist that was notoriously hard to cultivate. The next morning, the lab was abuzz with excitement over the opportunity to describe and sequence the specimen. She recalled, quote, "We dropped everything," end quote. Hemimastigotes represent one of a handful of Rumsfeldian known-unknown protist lineages, moderately well-described groups whose positions on the tree of life are not precisely known because they are difficult to culture in a lab and sequence. Protistologists have used peculiarities of hemimastigote structure to infer their close relatives, but their guesses were shotgunned all over the phylogeny, Simpson said. Without molecular data, lineages like hemimastigotes remain orphans of unknown ancestry. So, I mean, this article, again, it goes on for a little bit longer. There is a micrograph, photograph taken through a microscope of Hemimastix cuckwesii, the newly described hemimastigote named after a hairy, rapacious ogre from the traditions of the Mi'kmaq First Nation of Nova Scotia, where the specimen was collected. So, yeah. I will, as usual, include this link as well in the video description, and all of these links should be coming up here in just a moment, because I'm going to add them to the video description as soon as I finish this here business up. Let me see, there should be a, yeah, okay, there it is. And let me just put this in here as well. And let me come back here and paste. Alright then, so all of that should be visible to you all in a matter of moments, hopefully. It looks like there are 3 people watching, so hello to all of you. Thanks for tuning in. I don't have any more articles to go over today, or at least not at the moment.